The leaders of 7 leading industrialized nations who are meeting in Italy for a second day are working out their final declaration as the group takes aim at Russia and countries enabling Moscow's war in Ukraine. A draft communiqué seen by news agencies called on China to stop sending dual-use materials to Russia, such as weapon components and equipment used by Russia's defense sector. The draft statement is also set to include a vow that G7 nations will back Ukraine for as long as it takes in a further show of support for Kyiv. And in the Kremlin, Russian President Vladimir Putin has reacted angrily to the developments in Italy. Here's what he had to say about the G7's plan for a 50 billion euro loan for Ukraine, financed from the interest on frozen Russian assets.
Western countries have froze part of Russia's assets and foreign exchange reserves. And now they're thinking about how to provide at least some legal basis in order to finally appropriate them. But despite all the trickery, theft is still theft and will not go unpunished.
Let's get more on Moscow's reaction from DW's Grzegorz Szymanowski. He joins us from Riga, where DW has been reporting from since being banned from Russia. Let's focus in on Putin's threat that the seizure of Russian assets will not go unpunished. What kind of punishment might he be considering?
Well, Michael, Vladimir Putin didn't go into details today, but over the last weeks and months, as these proposals were discussed, we've heard many warnings from Kremlin officials against such move. The Kremlin has indicated that they will challenge any such decision as was taken by G7 today in court. So the Kremlin wants to pursue legal action. But secondly, there are also threats of retaliation. Now, Russia's options are limited because of decreasing foreign investment in Russia. There's not as many state assets in Russia that could be frozen. And this is why Russian officials have suggested that Russia could go after private investors' cash instead. And in fact, in late May, Vladimir Putin has signed a decree allowing seizure of assets of US companies, of US individuals, to compensate for any Russian assets that would be confiscated in the United States. So I think this will be this legal action and this retaliation. These will be the ways that the Kremlin will be exploring in the next weeks.
In other comments, as you well know, Putin also tabled a ceasefire proposal. Tell us what he said and to what extent it should be taken seriously.
Yes, Vladimir Putin laid out his terms for a permanent ceasefire in Ukraine, and he said that this is possible under 2 conditions. First, Ukraine should give up on the plan to join NATO, and secondly, even more importantly, he wants Ukrainian troops to pull out from the 4 territories that Russia claims to have annexed in 2022, the Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson and Zaporizhia regions of Ukraine. Now, Russia claims to have annexed them, but it doesn't control them in fully, so Vladimir Putin wants Ukrainian troops to pull out of them, of these regions. So obviously, these proposals are a non-starter for Ukraine. We've already heard from an aide to President Zelensky, who said that these proposals are offensive to common sense. Ukraine wants Russian troops to pull out from these territories, from the Ukrainian territory. And I think it's important also to mention what Vladimir Putin laid out as broader terms for these for peace in Ukraine. He repeated what we've heard for the last 2.5 years. Ukraine should be, in his terms, denazified, demilitarized. Crimea and these other territories need to be recognized as Russian territory. So I think these comments are important to be perceived in light of this big peace conference on Ukraine that will take place over the weekend in Switzerland. So where Russia is not represented. So Vladimir Putin wants to present Russia as the side that is apparently open to negotiations and concessions in an attempt to, I think it's fair to assess as an attempt to hijack the agenda of this conference.
Our thanks to DW correspondent Grzegorz Szymanowski in Riga, of course. Thank you. As we heard, G7 leaders also took aim at Chinese backing for Russia's war machine in their draft statement, which comes hot on the heels of a fresh round of U.S. sanctions on Russia to stop Beijing from doing business with Moscow. The draft statement also blasted China on a range of other subjects. Let's break it all down with DW's China analyst Clifford Coonan. Clifford, the G7 statement on China is pretty tough, saying that it will take measures against all actors in China who materially support Russia's war machine. What does this mean for the China-Russia relationship?
Well, right now, China is hitting the West in two key areas. It's hitting it on security and it's hitting it on trade. And these are two major issues. And the Russia-China relationship is where these two issues overlap. And so the response we're seeing is to address both of these issues using the tools that the West has in terms of sanctions, in terms of tariffs, which it's been introducing. As you mentioned, the US has just sharpened its sanctions, banking sanctions, and we're also seeing the European Union doing the same for electric vehicles because China is shipping so many electric vehicles to Europe that they're worried about that. So at the moment, what we're seeing is these two key areas being addressed in what is generally a fairly tough statement.
We should also mention the communique also says the G7 is not trying to harm China or thwart its economic development. How do we read that?
Well, it's an interesting, I don't really know what it means. We are basically trying to impose these sanctions, but at the same time, we don't want to thwart you. It's clearly a sop to China to make it look, this is nothing personal, and it smacks of German influence. Because one thing the G7 that we've seen is that there's a lot of division on how to deal with China and how to deal with these issues that it's facing. Germany is worried about affecting China, which is a huge market for its vehicles, and is worried that it's going to see reciprocal acts coming from China. So it's a kind of a sop. It's a weird statement, and I think it just highlights the differences that we're seeing within the G7.
The G7 also made a very strong statement about China's militarization of the South China Sea. Does this mark a different approach from G7 countries?
Well, this is very interesting, I think, because it's showing a shift as well. This is a very much a US aspect to this, and it's looking to more. The US is looking at its interest in the Pacific with the Australians, and also with the UK. How it's trying to help countries like the Philippines, where we're seeing increased militarization there. And it's also seeing China build up a huge military. So what you're seeing with this is a message saying that basically the US and the UK and in particular saying that we've got your back, and this is the way we see things developing in this region.
Clifford Coonan, always appreciate your perspective. Many thanks.